morning, everybody. It's still morning, isn't it? Yes. Right. A quick question before I get going. Can I just ask, I'm going to be talking about the Freedom of Information Act, Data Protection Act, the sort of information rights areas. Can I ask, who out of you actually deal with those at your council? Either data protection or freedom of information. Do you have a particular responsibility for dealing with those issues? Can you put your hands up if you do? Right, okay. Okay, a plea. When, particularly with regard to freedom of information, anything that you say that, I mean, hopefully you'll find what I say useful, but anything that you find particularly useful, can you feed it back to your clerk or to the person that does deal with it at your council? Okay, because there's a lot of practicalities I'm going to go through, a lot of hints and tips, hopefully. And there's also a lot of information on the table that I've got up in the hall. Please take the stuff back and pass it back to the relevant person. Okay, thank you very much. Right. What I want to do for the next 20 minutes or so, talk about the role of the ICO, the role of the Information Commissioner. Give you just sort of a few basics on the Freedom of Information Act. I'm sure you probably know that already, but you know, I'll just, yeah, a couple of hints and tips then around freedom of information. Then I want to talk for a couple of minutes on the Data Protection Act, the basics of that, and a few hints and tips around applying that act, and then a couple of minutes on how the ICO can help you in your day-to-day work as a councillor, as a clerk, in your own councils. And then hopefully there will be some time for questions at the end. So, number one, the ICO's role. Why am I here? Why am I standing in front of you? What am I talking about? Well, the Information Commissioner's Office, the UK independent supervisory body reporting to Parliament directly. One office that covers the UK, but we do have regional offices as well. So 4 locations across the UK. I run the Wales end of the business, if you like. I'm based down in Cardiff, the Wales regional office. And what we do, we oversee and we enforce the Data Protection Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Environmental Information Regulations, and something called the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regs, which sounds a bit of a mouthful, but which I'll mention again in a moment. What we actually do on a day-to-day basis, we give advice to members of the public, but primarily to stakeholders, to organisations, to businesses, to councils, whoever. We handle complaints from members of the public if they feel that they haven't, their information hasn't been handled properly, or they haven't had the information that they've asked for from their council, whoever. We will deal with those complaints. We will investigate. We also take enforcement action where that's required. We do have enforcement powers. The one that's hit the newspapers, the media, probably more than any in recent months, has been our power to fine up to £500,000 for serious breaches of any of the Data Protection Act principles. So yeah, we have the enforcement powers, but actually we prefer to come alongside to give advice, to give a bit of guidance on how to comply, rather than use those powers. A couple of examples of things we've done recently within Wales. Yesterday, if you were awake at 6:45 yesterday morning and you had BBC Radio Wales on, you would have heard me talking about an undertaking that yesterday we issued to Cardiff and Vale Health Board. That was when a consultant psychiatrist was cycling home from work. The bag dropped off the back of her bike and she lost a lot of sensitive data. So, okay, she wasn't aware of how she should have been transporting it, but actually there were processes in place. The Vale Trust, the health board rather, was at fault for not having told her how she should have been handling this data. So we issued an undertaking. Other action we've taken recently, we've issued a decision notice against the Welsh Government, asking them or ordering them to release more information about the First Minister's Delivery Unit, the programme for government. We've also issued a number of monetary penalties under the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regs that we lovingly call the PEC Regs, actually it's much shorter. to say it that way. One of the things that you may have seen in the media was the penalty we issued against Nev Wiltshire. You know, this guy from Swansea's call centre, was it Save Britain Money, is it called, one of his businesses? The guy that's been on the BBC, his company. He may be saving Britain money, but he's also causing an awful lot of annoyance and distress, actually, in some cases. We've had well over 3,000 complaints about his company, the way they conduct their business, and we've investigated that under the Privacy and Electronic Communications regs, because if somebody said they don't want to be called on a marketing calls, then that needs to be respected, and we've issued fines to Nev's company because of them not complying with those regulations. So that's just some examples of what we've done fairly recently. So, Freedom of Information Act. Basics. Well, it's all about disclosing official information, about the right of access to official information that's held by public bodies. There is a presumption of disclosure there, okay? It's not equally balanced. It's the presumption for disclosure is heavier than the withholding side, okay? You've got a weighing scales there. There are two duties on any public authority. Firstly, to produce a publication scheme, which is actually a guide to the information that you regularly publish, minutes, plans, whatever. So that's kind of the proactive, make it available, freely available, that side of it. But the other side then, the other duty, is dealing with individual requests for information. And those have to be dealt with within 20 working days. So there's strict time limits to the Act. There are exemptions. You may be aware of some of those. So you kind of need to know a little bit about it in order to apply it once the request comes in, because once you get a request into your council, the clock starts ticking. And if you haven't responded adequately, properly, within those 20 working days, the individual can complain to us. And believe me, many of them do. We are kept busy. So why is the Freedom of Information Act important? It's about openness, transparency in the public sector. I'm sure you'll be on board with that, that sentiment. Over the last few years, there have been some changes. The FOI Act has actually made changes. There's two examples I want to give you. Both will be known to you, I'm sure. The first one is around MP expenses. Do you remember just a few years back, this furore around MP expenses? What happened initially, well, the status quo prior to FOI was that there were only very broad categories of MP expense information available. FOI came in, and then requests were made. People wanted to know, they wanted a breakdown of MPs' travel expenses, and they also wanted to know about those additional cost allowances that they were using as well. So the House of Commons refused. Individuals came to us to investigate. We did that. We ordered disclosure of a greater breakdown of the detail. The House of Commons didn't like that and appealed it. And the tribunal and then the High Court, actually, when they reconsidered, they ordered release of even more data than we'd said to release. So at that point, that was really when the Telegraph obtained all of those receipts, those things that were splashed across the newspapers for, I don't know how long, a few weeks, I think, probably, wasn't it? And the full extent of the abuse of the system was revealed as a result. And there were political consequences. People stood down from their roles. There were criminal consequences. There were cases taken to court. You'll remember that. There was a new independent body set up to oversee expenses. So really, there's been a sea change. Because of FOI, there's been a sea change in expectations of transparency and accountability. I've got a Welsh example as well, just a shorter one, very quickly, to do with food hygiene inspection reports. A few years back, we dealt with a complaint in the Wales office where somebody hadn't received, they'd requested, but they hadn't received a copy of an inspection, a hygiene inspection report for a South Wales hotel. The local authority had refused to give it out. We ordered disclosure of that report, so it went out to the individual. The next step in the process was that there was a change of attitude, and you began to see the scores on the doors appearing. You know, those sort of 1 to 5 scores on restaurants, cafeterias, whatever, those scores were appearing there, you know, how well they'd actually done. And the latest development now within Wales is that the full hygiene inspection reports are going to be made fully available and on a website. So you can just go straight to see what the restaurant at the end of the road, how they do with regard to hygiene. So these are changes that the FOI Act has made in the last few years. Future changes, well, hopefully that change of attitude, the accountability, the transparency side, that will continue. But with regard to the actual legislation, there are some potential changes in line. Probably not very many, but there has been a review, a post-legislative review of how well the Act has been working. And there's been lots of discussion over the last year, 18 months or so, and we're still waiting to hear exactly what changes will be made. But I have to say they are likely to be minor changes. There may be one or two tweaks to do with the way you assess the costs. Our view on all of this is the fact that organisations really ought to make better use of the provisions that are already in the Act rather than sort of pushing for more change. But anyway, that's the FOI Basics for you. Some good practice tips. You need to be able to recognise an information request. Just a pointer here, questions can actually be valid requests for information. For example, if you're asked something like, I don't know, on what basis does the council allocate allotments to local residents? That's a question, but in terms of the Freedom of Information Act, you can reply to that because there'll be information that sort of backs up the answer. Okay? So questions can be information requests as well. You need to know what you hold and where to find it. And you need to know how to respond to a request. And if you're not going to supply the information to the individual, you need to set out clear reasons why you're not doing it. Because otherwise, all that will happen is they'll come back to you, they'll complain. Set out reasons why you're not going to be supplying it. It's a good idea to talk to the requester, to have a dialogue with them if you can. There is a duty under the Act to advise and assist individuals. But if you have that dialogue, very often, or in most cases, the requesters are reasonable people. They want the information, you've got it. You can kind of come to an agreement between you. You can work together to get a kind of mutually acceptable response to their information request. You need to take care if information includes details of other individuals. You can't go releasing other people's data to somebody else. That's the Data Protection Act concern. That's a no-no. You need to ask, is it environmental information? Because there are a different set of regulations where it is environmental information. And the other point I wanted to make, if the information is only held in the Welsh language, FOI does not require you to translate it. We've had this question a number of times. If you hold it in Welsh, the FOI request is for information that you hold. There may be a requirement under Welsh language schemes, whatever, for you to translate it, but FOI does not require you to translate it. A few more tips. Information or documents. The right to act to information under the FOI Act is information, is for information, it's not for documents. It may be easier for you to actually disclose a document as opposed to some information, but actually the right is to the information. You don't have to disclose the entire document that it sits in. You need to be familiar with the key exemptions, the ones that you're likely to use. For example, personal data exemption, prejudice to commercial interests, legal professional privilege. And you need to make use, if it's appropriate, of the Section 14 exemption in the Act, which is for vexatious and repeated requests. Again, we've had a number of conversations around this particular exemption, and our view is that it's not used enough by authorities, by organisations. Now, I'm not saying you can just apply it willy-nilly, because clearly most requests coming into you are going to be valid and need to be responded to in terms of giving out the information. But there is an exemption for vexatious and repeated requests, which you have to consider. I've got some guidance on the table up in the hall there. I think some of the copies are already gone. I've got one here. This is the guidance that's on our website dealing with vexatious requests. If you have any issues that way, do look at the guidance. We try to be as helpful as we can with what we set out for you. But the kind of things that you need to consider are disproportionate burden. Would it cause your council a disproportionate burden if you were to supply the information requested? What about the level of disruption, the level of irritation or distress that it might cause? Is there a serious purpose to the request? Is there a legitimate motivation? And what about the wider public interest? Is it just one individual, or is it a wider public interest at stake? Is there an objective value? So those are the kind of things that you want to be thinking about when you're responding, or when your clerk or whoever is responding to an FOI request received by your council. Okay, a word just to councillors now, quickly. Individual councillors are not public authorities for the purposes of FOI, but they are data controllers for the purposes of the Data Protection Act. Okay? So if you as a councillor receive a request for information from somebody, you are not required to respond yourself. What you need to do is pass it on to the clerk or to the person in the council that deals with those requests. You don't do it yourself. Okay? The authority, the legal entity, is the council. But having said that, you will be, if you're a councillor, if you're processing somebody's personal information, you're handling somebody's personal information in your role, purely in your role as, say, a ward councillor, so not on sort of council business, but in your role as a ward councillor, then you are a data controller for the purposes of the Act, and the full weight of the Data Protection Act will apply to how you handle that data. Okay? So, Data Protection Act Basics. There are 8 principles which are at the heart of the Act. The purpose of the Act really is to protect the privacy of the individual. I'm sure you'll know that. So these 8 principles then, all data controllers, all organisations handling personal information have to comply with these. Processed fairly and lawfully. Obtained only for one or more specified purposes. The data has to be adequate, relevant, but not excessive. It needs to be accurate, needs to be kept up to date. You don't keep it for longer than necessary. You process it according to the individual's rights. The Act gives individuals a number of rights, one of which is called the subject access right, the right of any one of us to have a copy of the information that an organisation holds on us. That's the subject access right. The information must be kept secure. That's the one that's caused so many issues in the last few years, and the issue that we've issued an awful lot of monetary penalties over as well. And the 8th one, we won't worry about that one in the context of today. The future of the Data Protection Act is there's a big question mark hanging over it at the moment. This is a whole other issue, which I'm not going to bore you with, but there is an EU regulation that's being debated, talked about, to replace our current Data Protection Act and bring in something that's completely, well, it's not completely different, obviously it's going to be very similar issues there, but a completely different way of handling people's data in the legal sense. So, but that's all kind of up for grabs at the moment. The latest I heard, there was something like 3,000 amendments that have been proposed to this regulation. So it may be some while before we have to worry about that one yet. A couple of hints and tips around using the Data Protection Act. We've done an awful lot. I said earlier on that a large part of our role is going out and giving advice and getting alongside businesses, organisations. We've been doing a lot of audits. I know that strikes fear to the heart very often, doesn't it? But what we try to do is come alongside and make these as helpful as we possibly can, give you advice on how to comply with the 2 acts. We also do something called advisory visits, which are a kind of cut-down version of the audit. And we're getting a lot of intelligence back now on the kind of problems that there are, the good practice, but also the areas where actually things need to change a little bit. So some of the points following now are things that we found from when we've done audits or advisory visits. First thing, you need to know what personal data you hold and how you hold it. Sounds very basic, but you'll be surprised at the number of organisations who have no idea really what they've got, where it is, how to access it. It's really, you know, it needs to be organised. You need to know what you have and where it is. You need to think about who has access to that data as well. It should be on a needs basis, not just a, well, whatever, it's there, anybody can look at it. It has to be on a needs basis. Think back to yourself. Very often it's a good idea with data protection. Put yourself in the shoes of you know, whoever was making these decisions. You know, would I like it? Would I like that to happen if it was my data? That's quite a good yardstick, I find sometimes. So you need to make sure then you have adequate security for manual files. Are the files in a heap on the desk somewhere? On full view? I used to work in a library, and one of the things we used to have to be quite careful about was when people came up to the desk and we'd pull up things on the screen, there'd be things, all their details, their home address, visible to us and the individual concerned, but also potentially to the other people in the queue. We had to be careful that we didn't accidentally reveal somebody else's data. So, you know, is the data accessible easily to the people who shouldn't be seeing it? If you take data home with you, who else, you know, does the family look at it? Or do you keep it locked away somewhere? And how do you dispose of it when you no longer need it? Do you just put it in a black bag, put it up for the rubbish man? Or do you shred it? Again, bin bags have caused a huge number of issues, of enforcement action on our part. Technical measures, you need to make sure there's technical measures in place, things like password protection, strong passwords, not things like admin or guest or whatever. Locked screens as well, and encryption of anything that's portable. If you're taking it away somewhere, encrypt it. That's not complicated to do, but it does need to be done if there's personal data involved. And then physical and building security, think about that too. Do cabinets get locked? I had a lovely example just a few weeks ago of a business that, yes, they had lovely, strong cabinets for filing things away, and they were all lockable, and they locked them at the end of the day as well, but then they left the keys on the top of the cabinet. So it's kind of, you know, not very sensible, really. And are you in a shared building? You know, are there other people within that, you know, movement within the building? If you could pop out to lunch, do you lock the door behind you, or can anybody just go in and have a little nose around? These are all things to think about. Good practice in terms of data protection. Do you have procedures in place? They don't need to be complicated, but do you have procedures? Retention schedules, in other words, how long you keep information for. Do you have things like a data disposal policy? You know, is your policy just stick it all in the bin, or is it get it shredded, confidential data shredded? Hopefully it's the latter. Would you recognise a subject access request? I mentioned that a moment ago as one of the rights that individuals have. Would you recognise it if it came and landed on your desk? Would you be able to respond to it? One of the things that's on the table up there in the hall is this piece of guidance. How do I handle subject access requests? Nice and straightforward flowchart of what to do. Beware email autocomplete and pre-programmed fax numbers. Fax is something that's probably dying these days, isn't it? But it still causes problems. But email autocomplete, do you know what I mean? Where you start to type somebody's address in and then something else pops up. It's being very helpful in suggesting who you might want to send something to. Do be careful if you're sending personal data to somebody else that you're actually sending it to the right person. Again, we've had some wonderful examples. There was something not very long ago, a Welsh police force, I'm not going to say which one, although if you go back and Google it, you'll find it very easily. What they did, they emailed CRB checks of 10,000 people accidentally to a member of the public because they chose the wrong name. And do you know what made it worse? That member of the public was a journalist. You can imagine what happened next. Yeah. So do be careful. I mean, my name, Anne Jones, A. Jones, I had a look down on the attendee list, and there's another A. Jones in the room. I won't embarrass you by asking who you are. But there's an awful lot of us about, Joneses. We're very common, aren't we? Sorry, we're popular, we're not common. But, you know, it's just so easy. You know, you want to send something to just choose the right person when you're sending personal data. And then data in transit. Again, this is an area where we've had so many problems. I already mentioned the undertaking we issued against Cardiff and the Vale yesterday. but so many different examples of data being, confidential files being left on trains, in bus shelters. There was something with Oliver Letwin fairly recently, a few months back. Do you remember that one where he, I think that was in a park bin, he left some things. Backs of cars, people have stopped off at the pub and have left things in cars or left things behind in the pub. It all causes issues. We get to know about them, we have to take enforcement action, and we do. How we can help you. As I said, it's a huge part of our role. We've got printed guidance and we've got a lot of stuff on our website. If you're not familiar with the website, do have a look at it. There's loads on there. I brought a lot of stuff with me today. If it's all gone, I noticed by about 10 o'clock there was a lot of it that had gone, so that's good because I don't want to take it all back with me. But if you can't find anything on there, then, as I say, have a look at the website. The hard copy stuff is available to order as well, but just do get in touch with us and we can sort you out. We can point you in the right direction. But just some of the things I wanted to bring to your attention quickly by way of resources. We've got training DVDs. This one, day-to-day hygiene, this is data protection. They're about 15 minutes long, and they're not, they're sort of broken up into short bits. They're really not, they're interesting to watch. They're not boring, whatever, and you will learn a lot from them. There's a Freedom of Information Act training DVD as well, called TikTok. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to bring any of those with me today, but we have got them available, so please get in touch with us in the office and we can send them out to you. The first person to come and ask me can have this one I've got with me now, but this is the only one. But again, about 15 minutes gives you the absolute basics in a quite a fun way of how to comply with the Act. There's another one here, Freedom of Information and Environmental Information Regulations. Great, this is quite short, sharp, to the point, easy read, useful, I would hope. And then handbooks, if you want something that's a little bit more meaty, I brought some of these with me, the data protection handbooks, and there were some on the freedom of information as well, but I think those have all gone when I last looked. But again, on the website. So lots of stuff that we can help you with. Some of them available in Welsh as well. The ICO website I mentioned, lots of stuff on there. The helpline, we do have a main helpline, but also in the Cardiff office, we'll take calls, we'll help you out there, we'll assist too. So give us a call. Bespoke awareness raising. We're limited resources in the Wales office, but we do what we can to help out. So particularly if there's umbrella groups or groups where maybe a few councils have come together, we'd be very happy to come together, to come and meet with you and talk through some of these issues, give you a bit of advice, come alongside. So please do get in touch with us. And my very last slide, well, almost last slide, just a screenshot of our website. It's www.ico.org.uk. And the final slide is our contact details.